It's been a while since we've been in the Bay, so good to see you all again. For those of you that don't know us, GerritForge, we've been part of the Gerrit community since 2009, based here in Sunnyvale. As a business, we offer enterprise support for Gerrit installations to some of the largest companies in the world. And news from this year, we're official partners with Google Cloud, with which we are proudly partnership to offer Gerrit as a service. So if you go on Google Cloud, you can get in touch and have your own Gerrit instance running in the cloud managed by us. So main topic, who is the owner? A deep dive into the owner's plugin, and we'll look at some other things as well. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Danny. I'm an engineering manager at GerritForge, also a Gerrit community manager. That's pretty much it. Today's agenda, so there's going to be a short history of the many owners plugins. I don't know how many of you know, but there's quite a few, so we'll make some clarity on that. We'll talk about the various roles in the change. This can be confusing sometimes. We'll talk about the submit rules versus submit requirements, the debate. I don't really think it's a debate, but anyway. We'll deep dive into the owners plugin for a bit, and then we'll look at the owners and the code owners, some differences, some similarities. It's not going to be an extensive comparison, but we'll just touch on the main topics. And then finally, how do you assign reviewers to changes automatically? First of all, what is the problem we're trying to solve? So say you've got a big monorepo. A monorepo doesn't even need to be that big, or any repo really, and you've got different components in the repo, and you want to have different teams working on those components independently so they don't touch each other's directory inside the same repository. You don't really have a way of doing that without either the owners or the code owners plugin. So it essentially allows you to have a sandbox environment, I would say, where you've got separate ACLs for your teams. And these teams could work in completely different ways. They could have completely different rules for how they're going about the code review. And the owners plugin allows you to manage that very effectively. So I want to touch on the history of the owners plugin. Promise I won't be too long. So in 2009, Vadim Spivak, who's the guy that, as we'll see in a second, created the owners plugin, was as an ex-Googler. So he left Google in 2009 after 4 years of working there. He moved to VMware. And between 2009 and 2013, we can only assume that he wanted a way of managing this situation that I just described with the different teams in a way that wasn't really available at the time. And so I figured out a way of doing it, reproducing what they had internally in Google that hadn't been open source yet. And in 2013, he started this owners plugin project and did the initial commit for it. In 2017, then Google open sourced their own internal way of managing owners with a plugin called Find Owners. Sharing their internal mechanisms with all of us. In 2020, they created a new plugin called Code Owners. I think it was Edwin that created the first commit. And then in 2021, they commissioned the Find Owners plugin. So I've said owners a lot of times. There's the owners plugin, which is supported and maintained by the community. We do a lot of work on it. A bunch of other companies do as well. There's the code owners plugin, which is managed by Google. And then there's the Find Owners plugin, which was managed by Google, but it's officially deprecated. They recommend not to use it. So really what we're left nowadays is the owners and the code owners. All right. So let's mention for a second, what is an owner? So if any of you guys, this might sound like obvious, but it's actually quite confusing in the Gerrit world. If any of you guys have seen the change info screen, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is when you create a change, you're presented with this. And there we can see owner. So surely that's what we're talking about today. Wrong. So the owner on the change screen is actually the user that uploaded the first patch set of the change. That's all that represents. You then have authors and committers. That is a Git core concept. I'm not going to go into it, but anyway, it's quite straightforward. And then you have the reviewers, which are the users who have been requested to review that change. Okay. You've got the CC, So the difference between CC and reviewers is that you would expect reviewers to have a active role in that change, to actively provide feedback and interact with you. CC is just for information. You don't really expect them to be doing much. If you've been looking at it intensely, you'll see that there's a chevron next to some of the users. That's the attention set. So I think this is actually a concept that's unique to Gerrit in the Git hosting world, where that little chevron indicates whose turn it is to act on the change. And this also will show on your dashboard. So when you go to your dashboard and it says your turn, if you go on those changes, you will have a chevron next to your name. And also this dictates who received the emails, notifications, and all of that. So yeah, I think this is extremely interesting, and it'll come back later in the presentation. So going back to the initial question, what is an owner in the context of the owners plugin or code owners? And it's essentially someone who has been required to approve changes to a specific code path. Okay, so we'll see in a second how they're defined and everything, but this is the generic definition. You might be forgiven for thinking that an owner and a reviewer are essentially the same thing, but they're really not. So reviewers, as we saw just a second ago, are people that have been asked to give input on the change, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their approval means that that change is submittable. Okay, this is actually an important concept. So you can have a reviewer that gives a +2, but if that reviewer is not an owner of that change, that's just an opinion that he's expressing approval of that change, but it's not going to affect the submittability of that change. So how do we define who is the owner? You define an owner's file. You can position this in two places. You can have it in the target branch of your change, or you can have a global owner's file in the refs meta config. If you have it in both places, the one in your branch is going to take priority. Jacek, correct me if I'm wrong. And we'll dive into the formats of the various owners' files just a second. But we've said that an approval from a reviewer or a non-owner doesn't necessarily mean that the change is submittable. And there's also more complicated scenarios. For example, say that you're working on your own test branch and you don't really want to have the whole shebang of people reviewing your changes that you would usually have. How do you do that? So yeah, what defines the submittability of a change? There's a few different ways. You've got submit rules, which are a way of deciding if a change can be submitted. They're defined using Prolog rules. For those of you that don't know, Prolog is actually a fully fledged language. It's its own language in its own right. So it can be, you can extend submit rules with Prolog predicates. That's what the owners plugin did before 3.6. It's really, really powerful. It's a really powerful language, but it's really hard to comprehend and maintain. We'll see in a second an example of a Prolog rule. Liam is looking at me like he knows the pain. Yeah. And they're really, really hard to maintain because essentially what ends up happening is that you have developers or teams that have a long history of these Prolog rules, maybe have been around for years. Then the people that originally wrote them left, and now nobody knows really what they're doing, and they need to be updated, and God knows what you're going to touch. And also, most importantly maybe, they can cause really unpredictable performance in your system. So I'm not going to go into the details of how Prolog works because I don't even know myself, but the generic concept is that there's each iteration, each computation is called the reduction, and the default limit of reduction is 100,000. But if you go over that limit, your change will be stuck in a bit of a limbo state where, because it wasn't able to do the whole computation, your change is not submittable, but it's also not submittable. And so people will go in there and just remove the reduction limit by setting it to 0. And then that can essentially cause your system to slow down and grind to a halt if the worst was to happen. I'm going to say this a few times, but these have been deprecated. Do not use them since 3.6. Just get rid of them as soon as you can, essentially. I did say they are confusing. So as promised, here is an example of a submit rule. Apparently, this is a really simple one. I took this just from the documentation. It's the first example you find. And apparently, it tells us that this is the default predicate to enable the submit rule if one of the owners has given a code review +2. I dare any of you to tell me that at a first glance of this. So yeah, again, yeah, just very confusing. This is why the the Gerrit review project has moved on to submit requirements, which is the next shiny thing. This is nothing new, by the way. This has been around 3.6, so we're talking a few years at least. It's a different way of essentially achieving the same thing. They are defined in the project.config, not in rules.pl, and they're based on predicates, same as Prolog. And plugins can extend them. So you can have plugins extending your submit requirements as the owners and the code owners plugin do. It's a much more easily understandable syntax. We'll see that in just a few slides. And then finally, we've talked about submit rules. We've talked about submit requirements. So what the heck is a submit record? There's quite a lot of similar terms, I'm going to say. But the submit record is, I'm going to say, the final monster. It's the data structure that actually computes if a change is submittable and applies those submit rules and those submit requirements and then stores the information in the index. It's stored in the changes document index. It applies to both submit rules and submit requirements, and it's also searchable. So you can search the submittability state of a change. There's a few possible values, nothing groundbreaking here. So if that wasn't clear enough, so you've got Prolog rules and submit requirements, they both feed into submit records, and this then ends up in the change index. If I haven't said it, Prolog rules are deprecated. Don't use them. Okay, so time to dive into the owners plugin for a little bit more. So as promised, here's an example of a submit requirement. So this is called owner approval. Now, you'll actually find in the docs some submit requirements that have the same name as classic labels like verified or code owners. That's not really recommended. Don't give it the same names. And then let's look for a second at the fields. You've got the description. You've got the submittable if, which is the crucial part here. As we'll see in a second, we've got this submittable if has approval owners, which is something that the owners plugin provides, but you can use there whatever you want. As long as I think it's all of the things you can search for, all of the search predicates can also be used in the submittable if. You've got the applicable if, and this ties into with what I was saying earlier. So if you've got your own branch that you don't want these rules to apply to, you can say, don't apply this to branch name refs meta config, for example. And then you can even have override if. Now, don't do this at home. But in this case, for example, if it just reviewed a code review +2, then it would override the submittable if and allow you to submit it. And then, interestingly, you can decide if the submit requirements can or cannot be overridden in child projects. All right. So you could say that this has to be enforced company-wide, so no child project can inherit it. Or, yeah, I don't really care too much. Teams can do whatever they want to do and allow teams to override it. Of all of these, the submittable if is the only one that is compulsory. So you don't need to define the other ones. So really. All right. Now, how do you enable the plugin? Of course, you need to install it and add the jar to the plugin directory. But then if you're not using either the has approval owners, as I show there in the submittable if, or if you don't set the owners enable submit requirement true, even if you have the plugin installed, it's not really doing anything. Okay. So yeah, has approval owner essentially enables the functionality. And then the owners enable submit requirement. It's actually not a predicate. It's a configuration value that you need to put in your Gerrit config. It's disabled by default. So these are not enabled as soon as you install it. And it's essentially the default submit requirement. It uses the same logic as what you would do if you did this. So essentially it just ensures that all of the owners applicable have approved the change. It cannot be overridden and applies to all of the projects. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. Now let's look at an example owners file for the owners plugin. So the code owners has a different owners file, which I'll show afterwards. But yeah, so it can be inherited. So you can have layers of inheritance of the owners. You can set that to false, obviously, if you don't want that to be the case. There's a few different matches. So you can have suffixes, regexes, and exact path if for whatever you want to do. And then finally, and this is really important, it's support groups. Now, why would we want to support groups? So the number of owners could be very large. So you don't want to be like putting emails of specific users or name of specific users there and have to maintain it when people leave or join, which makes it really hard to maintain. And also the fact that you can use groups that come like externally from your LDAP or the groups that already exist in Gerrit makes it very easily to integrate in your compliance structure. So if you've got an organization that really cares about how the security is managed, then this will obviously be much easier. So yeah, what does the UI look like? Now, Liam and Deepo have had this plugin installed for a while, so they're gonna look at this slide being like, what? There's a UI? So yeah, I've been blabbering on for a little bit now, so I'll show you what all of this looks like. So I've currently installed the old version of the owners plugin, and you can see I've got my reviewers here, but other than that, you can see that there's the owner approval in the submit requirements section, but other than that, there's just not much. There's just not much going on here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and install the new, actually, let me do a tail of the error log to make sure that the plugin is reloaded. I am gonna, oh, not a Vim, sorry. I am gonna rename, so I've got an old file and a new file. This should be reloaded within the next 10 seconds, hopefully. Yeah, 39, there we go. So it's installed a new plugin. So hopefully if I reload the page, I might need to open a new window, but here we go, that works perfectly. You can see quite a few things have changed. So we've got the own files section. So I'm currently logged in as administrator, okay? I've got the own file section, but let's try and log in, because I'm not the owner of anything. So let's try and log in as a different user. Or actually, first I should probably show you the, owners file for the repository. So if we go in, browse the repo, if we go on master, you can see that the owners file looks like this. So you've got your suffix.java files are owned by Java developer and Java principal engineer, while the suffix.bazel is owned by a group called Bazel reviewers. I can tell you that the members of Bazel reviewers are Bazel developer and administrator. All right. And then the submit requirements is just essentially the default submit requirement. Okay, so back to us. Because I'm the administrator of the Bazel files, it's telling me that I need to own, as we see here. And this is crucial, all right? You can see here that it says needs owner approval of the Bazel expert and the administrator. This is super important. And it easily allows me to select the emails of those users interested that are owners of this file. So if I click on here, it'll just copy the email if I need to change them or whatever reason. And then what's interesting though, and what I wanted to make clear, that just to highlight, Bazel expert and administrator, if I then go in the reviewers and I remove Bazel expert from the reviewers, okay, he's still listed as the owner. He's still, even if he's not a reviewer, he still needs to approve this change, okay? Even if he's not listed in the reviewers, which is what made it really tricky before with no UI. You had no way of knowing who the heck you had to chase. So now you can. You also have the own files tab, which I think is really interesting. It only highlights the files that you need to act upon. And this only shows if you're the owner of anything on that change. So if you don't own anything, you won't see this. It means your input is not required, or is like you're not owning any files. And then hopefully if I go ahead and approve this, this will turn in a tick and it tells me I've done everything I need to do on here and everything has been approved, all right? To show that I am not lying, if I sign in with a different user, I actually haven't tested this. Well, just found a bug. Perfect. I actually haven't tested this. I'm not sure what this user is. But yes, well, actually, no, I haven't found a bug. Sorry. What am I saying? It's just telling me the owned files tab doesn't appear, as I was mentioning, and you still see that the files have been approved by someone. So done the demo. So I'll talk quickly now, as I promised, about owners versus code owners plugin, because a lot of people get confused, like, what's the actual difference between here? And there's actually quite a few substantial ones. First of all, this maybe is not the most substantial, but they contribute different predicates. The code owners has two, one that tells us if the code owners is enabled at all, and one that tells us if the owners have approved that change. You can use this in your submit requirement, and then, and then the owners plugin is really only has something very similar to the has approval code owners. Really, conceptually, these are the same, the same thing. This and this are the same thing. This is the crucial one, though. This is the biggest one to me. Group support. Code owners that not support groups. You cannot have groups in code owners. You need to list all of the users all of the time, and you need to keep it up to date. While the owners plugin support groups. I think this is the really big one. The owners files also look different. Obviously, they've got different capabilities. So the code owners, as I said, you need to list all of the emails. You need to have an owners file in each directory that you care about. And you can have more restrictive stuff per file if you care, and assign different users to different files. And you can even import owners files from different directories if that's something you care about. While the owners plugin, I've already talked at length about the format, but you can see here it's a bit, it's a YAML, and obviously takes advantage of the extra capability with the groups and all of that, and regexes and matches and all of that. UI feedback. Now, obviously, as I said earlier, the owners plugin used to have no feedback. Now we're pretty much on par. If in some situation like this one, maybe slightly clearer as the code owners. Yes, it tells you which files have been approved, which files have not been approved, but then it only tells you that if it's been approved by code owner, doesn't really specify much more. While we highlight, well, the owners plugin also highlights who are the people that need to approve it or have already approved it. In case you're wondering, if there's like 100 approvers or 100 owners, it will show the first 5. It won't show you the whole list. And another thing to mention that maybe I didn't is that you can decide if you want to expand the groups or not. So if you're using groups, you can tell it, oh, expand the groups and actually show me the users that are part of that group, or just show me the name of the group. That's something you guys can decide. And now we get to an interesting part. So as I mentioned, the reviewers are not necessarily the owners, and the owners don't necessarily appear in the reviewers section. This is true for the owners plugin. The code owners works by allowing you to suggest the owners. So a suggest owners button will appear, and it will add them to the reviewers. And then if you want to remove them, you just remove them. And yeah, the reviewers are added as soon as you click on that button. While in the owners plugin, all of the owners are derived automatically from the owners file. They cannot be removed. Like you just cannot remove it in the UI easily. You need to go and change, or you or someone needs to go and change the owners file for the owners to change. You can't just do whatever you want. And they're not necessarily added to the reviewers. However, there is a second plugin that can do that for you, and we'll look at that in a second. So yeah, how can you automatically assign the owners to the reviewers part? 3 ways. There's reviewers by blame, which I think is an interesting concept. What this does is essentially automatically figures out the git blame of the files that you've modified and adds the people that it calculates to your reviewers. It's cool, but I think maybe it's a bit too simplistic. You could have managers that don't tend to write much, but you want them to review stuff that end up never being added to changes. And also, it doesn't seem to be maintained anymore. I might be wrong. If you're a maintainer, I'm here. Come and correct me. But yeah, the last commit was 2 years and 9 months ago. There's also the reviewers plugin, which essentially just adds default reviewers to a change. However, this uses a different owners file yet again. So you're going to have to maintain at least 2 owners files if you're using this plugin. Personally, I don't think that's worth the hassle for what you're getting back. And then owners plugin, there's also the owners auto assign. It is actually a separate plugin from the owners, but it does live in the same repo. What it allows you to do, it allows you to add reviewers or in CC. So it doesn't necessarily add to reviewers. You can configure it so that you just add to the CC field if that's what you want. You can also have not in the owner, I didn't show this, maybe I should have, but in the owners file, you can have another section, which is reviewers, and it can add reviewers that are not owners. It's not going to request these reviewers to approve that change. And most importantly, it uses the same owners file as the owners plugin. So you have to only maintain one owners file and you're off, you're hitting the grind running. The logic can be really customized per project. So you can contribute your own Groovy script that allows you to say, oh, don't add people that are on holiday. Don't always add the same people. You can do, it's really customizable. You can do whatever you want. And I think that's pretty much it. Any questions? Luca, if you could read anything on the Slido, or if people here want to grab them.
Like, let's say a regex of files that match a particular group. If the owner gives a +1 or +2 on one file, does it apply to all of the groups, or see that person's in?
Yeah, so it will apply to all of the files that that person owns. You cannot approve a single file. If you approve, you're approving the change. You're approving all of the files that you own.
What are the future plans for the owners plugin? Any plans to merge it with the code owners? Jacek, what do you think?
I can try to answer. The biggest problem with code owners, apart from its flexibility, which is really, really great, is that it's not fully open source in the sense that we don't have any control of what changes can go in. It's still under umbrella of Google's projects, and now, I mean, even maintainers cannot merge changes there. So it's really, really hard to move on. There were proposals to add groups there, I guess some years already ago. Luca probably is aware, but it haven't materialized yet. So it's moving too slow, in my perspective, from community perspective as well.
Cool.
Yeah, I believe also when the code owners was born, there was the idea of making it extensible. But if you remember, Gerrit did not support cross-plugin extensions at that time. Yeah. So maybe now is the time. I don't know. Maybe it's a kind of discussion that we can trigger with Edwin. Edwin is the father of the code owners. Maybe we can put it back on the table and maybe they will allow it. We'll see. Yeah, the second one is, when will prologue rules be removed in the future versions of Gerrit? And this is for you, Danny.
So I've raised the change. Well, while creating this presentation, I realized that the default rules.enable setting is still set to true in 3.11. So literally yesterday I raised the change to set it to false. I need to get the test to pass. That's not going to remove them, but it's going to disable them by default in 3.12. Surely, I think I can say. But yeah, completely remove them. I'm not. Might be a bit longer.
How does the owner plugin perform with severe requirements compared to prologue rules?
Yeah. Jacek has given a whole talk on this. There's on the GerritForge channel, but yeah.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, there is a talk. It was last year in Gothenburg. So definitely go ahead and review it. There are a lot of details. What I remember, the comparison was still like a 4 times faster overall between 3.4 and 3.6 with submit rules, but 3.6 without on prologue and submit rules. Still, there was like a almost 30% improvement. So definitely worth trying. And I was just trying, the simplest prologue examples that were in owner's plugin. So if you have more, and I'm pretty sure some of you have more, then the performance improvements should be even bigger.
There we go. So can you restrict ownership to a subset of a file? Or is the granularity is per file? So basically, can I also say you're owner just of a half of a file?
I think the answer is no, but you guys correct me if I'm wrong.
That's a good answer.
But it doesn't mean that I wouldn't be able to support it in the future. Like if someone has this requirement, we can look into it, I would say.
Last one.
Yeah.
So is there any tool to migrate from Prolog to submit requirements?
Oh, interesting. I think the answer is also no, but Liam is looking at me like, please create one. Luca?
I could say that actually, so the submit requirements were created based on the cookbook of Prolog. So basically, whenever there was a recipe in the cookbook to say, if you want to do this, then do that, then of course, submit requirements were created to satisfy that requirement. And the same happens for the owner's plugin. It means that whenever there was in the owner's plugin documentation, there were different fragments of Prolog. And basically, whenever there was that fragment, then Jacek, that actually is the author of the submit requirements implementation for owner's plugin, then basically he did that. So I believe that potentially it is possible if anyone, let's say, has as a pattern that resembles some of those recipes, then definitely I believe it will be possible. If anyone is willing to write that tool, yeah, I will be more than happy to review it. Or if anyone has the need and want us to help, we will be here. Happy to help. Because I do understand companies may have maybe tens of thousands of projects and maybe they don't have a clue what is in there. And migrating them one by one could be really tedious. Absolutely.
All right. I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to finish by, unless any Luca or Jacek, you want to add anything?
No, Danny, you wanted to talk about maybe the next meetup in February.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're just going to say that. See you next time. So, 19th of February, we'll be back here. Same place. Yeah. And yeah, Luca himself is going to be here presenting it. I think it's going to be interesting. There might be, who knows, PRs in Gerrit? Maybe not. Who knows? Yeah. So, see you here. Thank you all. I'll stop the streaming now.